Well, I wanted to pose a question, and it comes back to this idea of calling, and especially in the area of preaching and pastoral ministry. Students who are in preaching classes might be asking some bigger questions about the calling that God has placed on their lives and what that looks like and what that means. And so as you reflect on your own calling and then also your own experience as teachers of preachers, what sort of counsel would you give to those who are trying to sort through their call?
I like the English expression, you'll grow into it. And I think of that when, for example, when parents get something for their children on Christmas and they get this huge shirt for them and the kid's complaining, saying, Mom, do you not know my size? Why did you give me this large shirt? It's not gonna fit me. Or those shoes, how come my parents don't love me? They don't know my shoe size. And sometimes parents will say, no, you'll grow into them. And I feel like God is like that with us at times in our own calling too. When we feel like, oh, God, the Father, he doesn't know my size. He doesn't love me. This is too much for me to bear. It's too heavy. It's too big. I can't handle this. I like to encourage my students to think of calling not as something that you just realize and you make a decision and that's it. But it's really, it's a discipleship, right? It's giving yourself to Christ every day. And I think we do that as preachers too. Every day is a new opportunity to present ourselves to God and say, here's my life, here are all my gifts and talents and all the things that I don't like about myself, all the failures, but I give that up to you and trust that God will do something amazing with those things, I think.
So in my intro to preaching class, some of them come from traditions where they do not use a manuscript. So I make them use a manuscript in the first and second sermon. I say, okay, you can use whatever you'd like to use for this last presentation. And so, needless to say, some fall in love with the manuscript and they just want, this is the way that I can do it. And they abandon kind of the more extemporaneous presentation. And so, those who have become so reliant on the manuscript, I've kind of allowed them to preach, and I'll walk up to the pulpit area and I'll take their notes from them if they're over reliant, and I say, just keep preaching. You know what you need to say, and you have something to say to us that no one else can say but you. So this is all right. This is a laboratory. Just give God your offering.
I never really prayed intentionally for my sermons. I decided one day that I was going to pray through my membership list every week, faithfully pray for individuals and families, and just make it a daily practice. And I can't tell you how God used that prayer to help me love my people more, but then they actually started listening more. And there is a direct correlation, I believe. That's our true source of power, is the Holy Spirit.
Matt, your discussion about prayer reminded me of the importance of fasting in Fiji, where I lived for 3 years. In that context, fasting for the sermon was a really important practice. People knew you were doing it. Often you would begin earlier in the week. There would be meals during the day when you would not eat, and then there would be a more extended time closer to the sermon. I was sharing this with a classroom of preachers once, and they're like, wow, that's exhausting. How is that sustainable over time? And one of the things that I realized I was leaving out of the story was, in that context, because there aren't enough ordained pastors to go to all of the Methodist churches, it's common to only see an ordained pastor once a month for communion, and the rest of those weeks they're lay preachers. So actually it's the community doing it for each other. So I'm fasting this week for the sermon, but next week you're fasting for the sermon, and the week after that you're fasting for the sermon. And I wonder if there is a way, in order to make these kind of conviction practices for preachers sustainable over the long term, to really invite the community into that spiritual work. that was one of the ways that community witnessed to me.
Your point about community also reminded me that there's ways that we can pray leading up to a sermon, but that doesn't mean we can't invite the community to pray on our behalf leading up to the sermon as well, or during the sermon. Not just praying for the sermon, but praying for corporate worship and praying for the whole time that God would move and work. And so it's interesting to think about prayer not just as an individual practice, but as a communal practice around preaching and around the service of worship.